welcome back to our kind of lecture phase of class and having to do things in this new fashion. Hopefully these will work where I'm putting these together and in a video format. Again, remember you all can always email me, call me, and ask questions, do whatever you need to do so you feel like you understand the materials. I hope everybody's doing well. I hope everybody's feeling good. I hope everybody's families are all well during this sort of strange times. Now, I heard from a lot of you folks regarding the last test number 2. Again, don't worry about it. I appreciate that you may not have been able to get it done. That was somewhat on purpose because I can't observe. Then we kind of have to do things differently, timing it. But I do appreciate the input that you guys gave me, that many of you struggled with the time period that I gave to you, and I'll use that in the next test and the time period that I'll use on the next test. But remember, it's curved, and so and I'll be sending you guys out information regarding your grades as soon as I can get them all graded. But remember, it's curved, so everybody's kind of under that same boat. All right, so we're into our third phase of class. We're moving to contracts. We've talked essentially about the law in general. We've talked about how businesses are formed and some torts. And now we're moving into an area that you're going to really have to deal with, and that's contracts, and how contracts and how important contracts are to your business. All right. I also want to let you guys know, as you've seen on there, we're not going to have a mock trial because of all this. It's just going to be difficult to bring into the court. Courts are kind of closed, and keeping all the social distancing that were required would not work well in that courtroom setting. So we're not going to have that mock trial. So those of you who are scheduled for that, don't worry about that at this point in time. All right, so introduction to contracts. We have contracts. They make business matters more predictable. That's really one of the important aspects of what contracts do. Both parties know what their purpose is in a contract, what they're supposed to do, how they're supposed to perform in that contract, and to some degree sometimes what the remedy will be or what their punishment would be if they fail to fulfill their obligations under that contract. And that's, again, so what those contracts also help to do is to avoid litigation. You need to understand most contracts, almost over 90% of all contracts, are fully performed by both of the parties. It's probably in the 99% range. Almost all contracts are actually fully performed. All right, examples of contracts you didn't understand you were entering into. All the apps on your phones and tablets and your computers and are all contracts you've entered into, and you press that little button that said I agree to these terms. You probably didn't go to them, but there were terms that you could actually go to and read as the terms that you were agreeing to. Well, you entered into a contract when you agreed to those particular terms. So you do that all the day. Also, when you walk into a store and you buy food, you are entering into a contract, or buy anything. They're offering you a product for a certain price, and you're accepting that and paying them, and that's a completed contract at that point in time. So again, every day you guys are actually engaged in contract negotiations and fulfilling contracts. I want to talk a little about the sources of contract law. There's always us judges in common law, and that's really the predominant area in which contract comes from. There is some statutory law for sure out there regarding contracts, but really it's common law, judges dictating how we're going to look at contracts, how we're going to require parties to do contracts, and in some instances when either a contract wasn't actually completed or there's just some unfairness to that particular contract, we're going to kind of work in equity to resolve those situations as well. That's more rare, but it is certainly something that the courts do as well. But that's all the common law we talked about in our first section of our class. And then in some instances, and quite frankly a lot of instances, Uniform Commercial Code. We're not going to get into that in this segment of our class. That's going to be in our last segment, segment number 4. We'll get into a Uniform Commercial Code that deals with sales, and that's a particular area we're going to get into sales of goods, I should say. All right, so those are your sources of contract law and kind of getting to this little basic understanding. Let's talk about the 6 elements of a contract, right? And I put 6+ there because there's writing as well, and so that's only required in certain circumstances. So it's not, I don't sometimes consider it one of the elements, but it can be if it's a particular subject matter. For example, property. All property has to be done in writing. All right, so you have 6 elements of contract law. In order for a contract to be legally enforced, you need to have these elements. 1, you have to have an offer, right? It's the original deal. For example, I offer to sell you my bike for $50. That's the offer, right? Then you have an acceptance. It's the I agree. It's the handshake. It's the nodding of the head. It can be done in multiple different ways, but it's the I agree to purchase your bike for $50. You have to have consideration by each party at the time in which the deal was made. In that deal that I just talked about there, each party was agreeing at the time the deal was made, right? When there was offer and acceptance, once the acceptance was done, deal was made, then there was consideration by both parties. I'm giving up my bike, and you're going to give up $50 to purchase that bike. So that's consideration by each party. Now remember, consideration doesn't necessarily have to be money. We'll get into that more a little bit later on, but it can be done. Your time can be consideration. Your expertise can be consideration, right? There's a whole lot of different ways in which consideration can be done. It's not always necessarily a monetary situation. All right, legality. It has to be legal for us to enforce that particular contract, right? If it's a meth deal, and you do, I offer to sell you a bag of meth for $1,000, and I agree. And one of us reneges on that deal. You can't go to court because court's going to say, look, it was illegal for you all to enter into that particular contract in the first place. Therefore, that contract is void. All right, so it has to be legal. Everybody has to have the right capacity, right? So when they enter into that deal, it means you have to have sound mind, right? Age appropriate. Your body needs to be, you can't have your brain kind of deteriorating, or you have some sort of really degenerative disease that's making it difficult for your body to actually make decisions or do the right things, or just taking over what your really mental capacity is able to do. All right, you have to have the capacity to enter. If you don't, it's a voidable contract. We'll talk a little about what the difference between void and voidable is as we move forward. All right, consent. You have to actually consent. Each party has to actually consent. There can't be any fraudulent activity. There can't be anybody holding a gun to somebody's head, or I'm going to do something to a member of your family if you don't do this, whatever, right? That's not consenting to the deal. That's coercion or fraud, right? Fraud is where you tell people certain things which just aren't true, and that gets them into that deal, right? And then in some instances, it has to be in writing, right? That's what I talked about in the area of property. Almost all property situations, the sale of a home, the sale of land, all those have to be done in writing, all right? So if you have an offer, acceptance, consideration, legality, capacity, consent, and in some instances writing, you have all the elements of a contract, and it's a legal binding contract. All right, let's move on to kind of getting into now types of contracts. It's a wonky area. It can be a little bit difficult. I'm going to do my best to sort of explain it to you. But just understand it can be a little bit wonky. And if you have questions, remember, ask me those questions. Send them to me, and I'll try to give you better examples if the examples I've given aren't good. Part of the difference between now is usually I can bounce stuff off you guys. You guys can ask me questions. We're just not going to have that luxury at this point in time. All right, so there is a bilateral contract. Think about what the terms mean, right? Bi means two, right? Means two or more, right? Usually bi means two. Lateral means this way. It's across the board type of a thing, right? So in this situation, you have both parties, right? That's the bi part of that. Both of them make a promise, and it's identical. It's across the board. I promise to sell you my bike for $50. You agree to purchase my bike for $50, right? That's that bilateral contract. In difference to a unilateral contract, in a unilateral contract, one party makes a promise. I agree to pay you $20 to mow my lawn, right? But the only way in which you can accept that is to mow my lawn. right? So it's a unilateral promise in the sense of I'm making a promise to pay you the $20, but the only way you can actually accept that promise or that agreement, that $20 and mowing a lawn, is to mow the lawn. That's a unilateral. Only I'm making the promise. You're actually going to perform an act to fulfill that particular contract. So that's a difference between a bilateral and a unilateral contract, right? And when we talk about unilateral contracts, then there are parts in which sometimes we talk about whether it's executory, where and this actually works for both bilateral and unilateral contracts, excuse me. But when it's executory, it means one of the parties has not fulfilled all parts of the agreement. It could be both of the parties happen. For example, when we talked about the bike for $50, right? I may not have given you the bike yet, and you may not have given me the $50 yet, right? Or I may have given you the bike, and you may not have paid me the $50 yet. Or you gave me the $50, but I haven't given you the bike. At that point in time, since somebody hasn't fulfilled their obligations, it's an executory contract, right? It is executed once all the parties have fulfilled their obligations. I've given you the bike, you've given me the $50, or I paid you the $20 because you mowed the lawn, right? Then those are executed contracts. All right. A valid contract, we talked about earlier, is one that satisfies all those 6 elements of the contract if writing is involved, and it also includes the writing element. That becomes a valid contract, so both parties are legally obligated to fulfill their obligations under that contract. If not, there are remedies that the court will utilize to make the parties whole. There is an unenforceable agreement. It's what parties bargain for, just cannot be enforced because of some rule of law. Now, this is different from whether it's legal or not. This is something where what the parties anticipated may have thought that was illegal, but turns out for whatever reasons it cannot be enforced. All right, there are different bases for that. For example, an unenforceable agreement might be where the law has changed. Back in the late 70s, when Iran took a bunch of our hostages, the United States passed laws that changed what we could sell to, or if you're a business, what you could sell to the Iranian government. And so there were contracts that existed at the time that were perfectly legal, binding contracts, became unenforceable agreements as a result of those changes in the law. There are voidable contracts. Voidable contracts is where one of the parties, for a variety of reasons, says, look, something happened, which means I can void that contract now. It's voidable. Doesn't mean they could say, I want to go forward with the contract, even though something, for example, a minor. If you walked down, you're under 18 years of age, you get your new car, you go down to the audio shop to get your new stereo put into that car, and they put it in there, and then you decide, nah, I don't want it, never mind, kind of a thing. Because you weren't 18 years of age, you couldn't enter into any agreement, therefore it's a void. You can void it out. Don't think you can get that done. Don't be telling anybody to kind of get that, because you're still going to have to give the stereo back, and there may be some restitution for the time allowed, but you can get yourself out of that particular contract. Maybe there's reasons for you to do that. Maybe you just realize you can't afford $700 or whatever it may be, so it's easier to pay $50 for labor and give them the product back. But it's voidable. It's not necessarily void as it would be in an unenforceable agreement. A void agreement is a contract that neither party can enforce because something made it illegal, or one party didn't have legal authority to enter into contract. In other words, they didn't have the authority to actually grant property or to sell the property because they were never the owners of the property. That's just a void agreement because they never had authority to enter into that particular contract in the first place. All right, so those are different types of contracts that you may hear. Whether it was a bilateral, unilateral contract, it's a voidable contract, or it's a void contract, or void agreement, or voidable. All right, those are things that you do need to know. They're things that you can see bolded there that you're going to need to know on the test, and you're going to need to be able to spot a few of those. So if you need more examples of those, let me know, and I'll see if I can give you some better examples. All right, You guys get to be the judge. In this particular case, Eunice Parcell is 20 years old and starting a new business by being a wholesaler and distributing goods in his hometown of Atlanta, Georgia. He enters into a big deal with bourbon distillers to buy, sell, and deliver bourbon. It's the first time he gets to put his name on a contract. Eunice agrees to purchase at least 100 boxes every year for the next 5 years and pay Big Bourbon $100 per box. For the first 2 years, everything goes great. However, in the third year, Eunice's truck breaks down and he's unable to continue with the agreement. Was there a contract? All right, this is sort of a sticky one. Remember, we got to go through our elements of a contract. Right? Do we have an offer? Yep. Eunice Parcell agreed, or offered, I should say Big Bourbon. Big Bourbon offered to sell to Eunice 100 boxes every year for 5 years for $100 per box. And Eunice agreed to purchase those boxes, right? So you have both an offer, you have an acceptance, you have consideration, right? Eunice Parcell is paying them $100 per box, and Big Bourbon is giving them the bourbon, right? So that is consideration for sure. It was consideration that was done at the time which the contract was entered into. So we're good on those elements. Now, legally, that's one of those questions. In this particular case, was it legal? What's the legal age for possession of alcohol? 21. And Eunice Parcell wasn't 21 at the time of this contract. So there's an argument to be made if you were UP trying to get yourself out of this, that look, this was not a legally binding contract because at the time I could not possess those, therefore it was illegal to do so, right? There's a capacity argument that could be made, right? UP was 20 years of age, and given the alcohol limit, there's a question of whether he was age appropriate because the legislatures have indicated that 21 years of age is what's mentally appropriate to be possession of alcohol, right? Probably not as good as illegality, but certainly it's an argument that could be made. Now that's when the contract was first made. Now the question then becomes, well, wait a second here. Everything was great in the first year. Everything was good in the second year. Now by the time we get into the third year, UP is now 22 years of age or 23 years of age. Therefore, everything's valid. He can legally possess them, he can legally sell them, etc. And so that's the other side of the argument that you would make if you were the Big Bourbon distilleries. Here's what I think the court would ultimately do in this scenario. One, it would probably find the contract was void because it wasn't a legal contract in when the parties actually entered into the contract. However, when it steps in as its equitable situation, it's going to say, look, that's maybe true, but UP was making money and made a profit. We're going to presume he made a profit in those first couple of years. When we get into our third year, he's legally able to do these things, and it had nothing to do with his legal age as to the contract not being able to be fulfilled, and therefore UP is going to have to compensate Big Bourbon for the remainder of that contract for that third year, but probably let him out on that fourth year, not require him to pay on that next 2 years, I should say, for those 4 and 5 years. All right, that's kind of how that would all work, and so hopefully that makes sense. Anybody has questions, again, make sure you send me an email, call me, or whatever, and I'll deal and help to answer those questions. Sorry about that. I'm actually at work, and so sometimes there are work things that I have to deal with. All right, so we were talking about implied contracts, and a really good example of an implied contract is a relationship between a doctor and a patient. Now, there's not an expressed agreement that I agree to fix your leg for $200 or anything like that, right? It is implied you're going to fix the leg, and it's implied that you're going to pay me if I'm the doctor to fix that leg, right? That's an implied contract. When the contract was formed, and it's still a contract, it's still a relationship, it's still obligations that the individuals have to each other, but there wasn't everything fully expressed. But that's the type of an implied contract, is a situation between like a doctor and patient. All right, so again, I want to talk about you guys being the judge, and I should have mentioned before we did the first, you be the judge, but in these situations, you should perhaps, before you get into my answers to those, pause the video, think it through. That's only going to be helpful for when you get the test, and you have to do this on the test. You'll kind of be able to say, all right, here's what I think we need to do, here's what I should be thinking about, and then kind of write your answers out. So kind of pause it and go forward from there. All right, so Jill Buck and Hound TV signed a contract to have Jill color commentate 10 football games, with Jill getting paid $100,000 per game. So Jill says, or I should say, Jill is so good at what she does, she continues for another 5 games. When she gets done with those games, she asked to increase her contract to $150,000 for 10 games. Now, Hound TV's like, are you kidding me? Who are you? You're lucky to be getting paid $100,000 from us. We're not going to do that. And not only that, we're not going to pay you for the last 5 games. We only contracted for 10 games, so heck with you, kind of a thing. All right. So, was there a contract? Well, certainly on the first 10 games, piece of cake, right? You had an offer by Hound TV to pay her $100,000 for her to color commentate games, and she agreed to use her time and her expertise as a color commentator for those 10 games. So you have an offer, you have acceptance, you have consideration. It's perfectly legal. Both people, our groups are of sound minds and bodies and everything, right? And nobody held a gun to anybody's head. It's not dealing with property, so it didn't need to be in writing, and I didn't put that in there. And it may have been in writing. It doesn't make a difference, right? So we have a valid contract, yes. Now, was the contract enforceable? Certainly, again, for the first 10 games, absolutely enforceable. If anybody had not paid or not done the games, color commentating, Jill hadn't, certainly anybody could have sued for a breach of contract, right? Absolutely enforceable. Was the contract voidable? Can't see any reason here why it would have been by either of the parties in this particular case. Was the contract express or implied? Now here's where it gets a little bit tricky, and we'll kind of talk about this. Certainly, the first 10 games was an expressed bilateral contract, right? It was expressed, the terms were fully advised to each of the parties, it was unilateral, each party was making a promise, right? So you have an expressed bilateral contract, right? Perfectly easy to figure out. Those next 5 games, however, you have what the court would consider an implied contract in that particular case. Hound TV never stopped Jill from going forward, and Jill never stopped going forward. So it was clearly implied in that scenario there that those next 5 games were part of that contract, right? It's still a bilateral contract in the sense that both parties have made a promise and they're clearly understood, but it wasn't expressed. Those 5 games in particular weren't expressed. They were just implied as they moved on. Now, with Jill, it's not going to get paid the $150,000 either. It's only going to be the $100,000 for those particular games. All right, that's kind of how that all works. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, if any of this doesn't make sense, make sure you send me an email, and I'll try to give you some better examples. All right. Let's kind of continue on with our introduction to contracts, and more importantly, what are the remedies when you don't have a contract, right? If for some reason all those requirements that we talked about were not fulfilled, and what happens if somebody does something relying on it? We've talked about promissory estoppel before. It's that situation where somebody makes a promise, somebody relies on that promise, and their reliance on that promise causes an injustice, or sometimes the easier way to remember it is a detrimental reliance. That makes it, you have a promise, reliance on the promise, and a detrimental reliance on the promise. If you kind of think it that way and build on it, sometimes it's easier to remember what the 3 elements of promissory estoppel are. You are going to need to know what the 3 elements of promissory estoppel are for the test, so remember those. So you can remember as promise, reasonable reliance on the promise, and an injustice, or promise, reasonable reliance on the promise, and detrimental reliance as a result of relying on that promise. All right. Promissory estoppel is what the courts will use as an equitable remedy to form sometimes contracts. And then there's different terms for when the court does that. So for example, quasi-contracts is a form of promissory estoppel, right? And sometimes the court's going to say, look, we really don't have a contract here, but we're going to form one. We're going to make it as if there actually was a contract because there was an injustice done through this process. And there are different types. So in a quasi-contract, an injured party, the plaintiff can show that the defendant benefited, and there was a reasonable expectation that the consideration of that benefit would have gone to the plaintiff, and by not going to the plaintiff, the defendant's going to be unjustly enriched if the court doesn't step in and do something. Here's an example. I think it's in the book if I remember right. If somebody has some land, they lease out that land, or they allow, I shouldn't say there's a lease because that would be a contractual agreement. They allow defendant to come in and raise some crops on that land. They do good crop, they sell the crop, right, and then they don't pay anything back. There was never a contract, there's never an agreement as to how much they would pay on that crop. Could be multiple reasons why. Nobody really knows what they're going to, whether the crop's going to be good, bad, whatever it may be. And so there was just no way that they had a binding agreement, right? Maybe they're good friends, who knows? In this particular case here, the state would say, or the court, I should say, would say, well, we're going to form a contract, right? We're going to assume that they're not going to just allow their land to be used with the understanding they're not going to be somehow compensated. And then the court's going to figure out what that compensation would be. What's the general market value of somebody using that particular crop in that particular region, and therefore require the defendant to pay that to the plaintiff for the use of their land, right? We're going to form the contract. Even if they didn't actually have one, we're going to make a contract, right? And quantum merit, part of that quantum quasi-contract is, all right, but now what's the remedy? What's the quantum merit? You guys know I love a lot of Latin terms, right? As much as he deserves, what quantum merit means. So in the case we talked about with the land, how much does the landowner deserve for allowing defendant to use that land to grow the crop? All right, that's something the courts use in a quasi-contract situation, right? And just to make sure it's clear, that's the court saying a contract, and for the contract, what the terms of that contract would be and what the remedies for breach of that contract would be. In a promissory estoppel situation, it might be different in that the defendant didn't gain a benefit. It would just be that the plaintiff was hurt. So, for example, in a situation in which the plaintiff agreed to sell land, and as a result of agreeing to sell, I should say a landowner agrees to sell land to somebody. The party comes in, they start digging and everything. There's no contract for it, not in writing, and then all of a sudden the owner comes in and says, I'm not selling you that land. Well, you relied on the promise of the owner of the land to sell it to you, and you have gone on and had expenditures of digging and maybe pouring concrete for the foundation, right? So there was a promise to sell the land to you. You relied on that promise, and you detrimentally relied because you had some costs associated with the starting of the building of that property, right? They didn't gain anything from it. They didn't, as you would in a quasi-contract situation, right? They weren't unjustly enriched from it. But you certainly are out some money. And in that situation, the term that the court would use is just promissory estoppel, right? That's the difference between that. So think about promissory. They're both kind of the same thing in the sense that there was a promise, a reasonable reliance, and some injustice. But in a situation in which somebody is harmed, right? They had to pay out money, or they lost business transactions, or whatever it may be, right? That's more promissory estoppel. Whereas if a defendant in a situation gained some sort of benefit as a result of the use of something, that's a quasi-contract situation. Hopefully that makes sense in understanding the differences between those two. All right, another you be the judge. Again, remember to pause and see if you can kind of come up with the different arguments for Homer Crusty Credit Company in this scenario. All right, while at work in the Springfield nuclear power plant, Homer Simpson suffers a heart attack as he is eating a donut. As he's unconscious, he's taken to the Springfield Hospital, where doctors fix his heart at several hours of open heart surgery. Now, Homer is grateful, but when the bill comes around, refuses to pay because I never asked them. Oh, I never asked them to do any of that, right? So the hospital turns the debt over to Krusty's credit company, and Krusty sues Homer for that money. Will Krusty prevail? All right, so you got to ask yourself, what's the best argument for Homer? Pretty simple, right? Look, he never agreed to this. For all we know, he would have been fine with dying, knowing he didn't have the money, kind of that It's a Wonderful Life scenario, right? If you know the movie It's a Wonderful Life, Homer Bailey jumps off the bridge because he's worth more money dead because of his life insurance policy than he is alive, right? Who knows? Maybe Homer was having the same thoughts. He had good insurance, and the rest of the family would have been better off with him being dead, right? Those are the type of arguments that Homer would make. Obviously, the argument for Krusty Credit Company is, look, we have a moral and ethical obligation to always, help people and save lives. And so that's what the hospital did in this particular situation. They had no idea whether Homer did or didn't want them, and there's no way for them to ask, hey, do you want us to do these things? None of those could have happened, and therefore you had that situation where that doctor-patient, we talked about it before, where there was an implied sort of a contract agreement in that situation. And then the other part of this would be, look, the hospital has that, and there's always a promise to take care of people, right? Detriment relied on the idea that he was going to, and they were now harmed out some money as a result of that, and or the argument would be Homer's benefit, that he's alive and there's something to the value of life, therefore he should have to pay back this money. In the end, this is a pretty easy one. The court's going to require Homer to pay back for the hospital or to Krusty Credit Company for the saving of his life. All right. So again, we've talked about the different types of contracts, offers and acceptances, and so we want to get into now sort of the each of the different elements in a little bit more detail. All right, so we're going to get into the offer, what it means, a little more detail, the acceptance, and some rules regarding the acceptance. There's a mailbox rule we'll talk about, right? And then in the second video, we'll get into consideration, legality, capacity, consent, and right. All right, so meeting of the minds. In both the offer and the acceptance, right, there has to be a meeting of the minds in order to have a contract. We need to be sure that both parties willingly went into that contract agreeing to what that contract would mean, right? And that's kind of the meeting of the minds. And the term that we use sometimes is the mirror image rule, and I'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later on. And it's very different, and you'll see from the Uniform Commercial Code, where even if there's some terms that are left out in the agreement, the UCC will supply some of those terms if they can. Whereas under common law, contract law, we usually, if there's not all there, then they don't have a contract, and then that's where that promissory estoppel or quasi-contract would then come in if there's something that the parties went forward thinking they had a contract even though some term was left out. Then that's what those elements or equitable remedies, I should say, will come in. All right. So in meeting of the minds, right, in both the offer and the acceptance, an act or statement that proposes definite terms and permits the other party to create a contract by accepting those definite terms, right? That's the meeting of the minds. Back to our original scenario, I offer my bike to you for $50, right? That's an offer. It's clear. You're going to get my bike, and you're going to have to pay me $50. There's nothing about that. It's very, very, very clear. And then what the court's going to be looking at is to determine if in the offer everything was pretty clear and understanding, right? So was there an intention to make a bargain? Clearly there was, right? I offered my bike to you for $50. Clear, I intended to make a bargain with you. Did my words, the offer or writing, indicate an intention to make that bargain? Clearly my words did in my scenario here, right? And were the terms reasonably definite? They were clear, right? There was no, well, and if you want me to throw in this or throw in that, I can do it. None of that right? It was crystal clear, $50 for the bite. All right, that's the meeting of the minds in regarding the offer itself. Are they definite? Is it clear understanding? So when the acceptance comes in, it is as crystal clear as to what they're accepting to, right? What they're agreeing to. So that's what the court's going to look at. Was there clearly intent to make a bargain, right? And were the terms reasonably definite? And so there's some items that are out there that you need to know that the courts have almost unanimously always held these are not definite terms, or these are not intents necessarily to bargain specifically with this individual. So usually invitations to bargain, right? If I send out some letter saying, hey, we'd love to work with you, come down and see me at the local car dealership or the local bike dealership, those usually aren't considered actual definite terms and intent to bargain, right? It's just an invitation, right? Hey, come on down, we'll chat. All right. Price quotes. If I have a bunch of items in my store and I send out a catalog, right, those price quotes aren't necessarily considered contractual, kind of a situation, right? Price quotes aren't, right? I'm just telling you, hey, here's what it is. Market may fluctuate or may change. I may actually have a sale on, or whatever it may be. Those quotes, you couldn't hold me to those particular price quotes. Those are not considered a intent, right? Clear intent. Letters of intent, that's where parties get together and they say, yeah, we've ultimately sort of agreed to this particular deal, and maybe you send it off to somebody saying, hey, here's what our letter of intent is. That's not going to be binding in a contract situation. Again, that's just sort of memorializing what we're kind of thinking at this point in time. So that usually doesn't amount to an actual offer. Advertisements, right? Again, they aren't considered an actual offer. So remember that, right? When you have those things, hey, come on down there, we've got 6 sweaters, and their first 6 people that get here get them for $5 a piece, right? That's just an advertisement type of a situation. Now, there may be state laws that forbid that from happening, but generally advertisement itself is not considered an actual offer. All right, auctions. Auctions with reserve, right? So there are auctions in which, for example, I remember my old Reggie Jackson baseball card. Maybe I decided I'm going to sell that rookie card, but I say I need to have at least $200 for that. That's a reserve. So if the auction goes off and it doesn't reach to the amount of $200 in that auction, then I actually haven't made any intent to bargain because I agreed it had to go at least $200. Now, once it gets past that $200, now I'm into the actual offer stage. I've offered that to be sold to somebody who agrees to pay $200 or more. Now, if there's no reserve, I don't put a dollar amount on there, then I have actually made an offer to sell my card to the highest bidder. All right. Again, let's you be the judge. McClintock owns 5 parcels of land which he raises cattle on. Cogburn wants to get into the cattle business, so he talks to McClintock about buying one of the parcels of land. They agree that McClintock will sell Cogburn one of the parcels of land for a fair price. They agree that if they can't agree on a price, Judge Roy Bean will decide the amount. They agree to meet each day for 5 days to look at each parcel. On the 5th day, before Cogburn decides which property he wants, McClintock decides he doesn't want to sell any of them after all. All right. So, was there an agreement? Was this an offer that was put out there by McClintock, who owns those parcels of land, to the point where once Cogburn says, I want that land, I want piece 5 or parcel 4 or whatever it may be, right? There is actually a binding contract in that situation. Certainly, there had been an offer up until that 5th day, right? Everything was satisfied. He was agreeing to sell his particular parts of the land. They had agreed on if there was not, they couldn't agree on a fair price, then they were going to have Judge Roy Bean come in and do so on that particular parcel of land. So yeah, there was an agreement at that point in time. Now, was the offer definite enough to form an offer that can be accepted by Cogburn? This is where it gets a little bit more difficult for the court in this particular case here, right? Since there wasn't an agreement on which parcel of land
it wasn't definite. Yeah, there was an agreement to sell one of the 5, and yes, there was an agreement as to what the price would be, that Judge Roy Bean would decide that price once that parcel went, but there was never an agreement as to which parcel of land it would be. So in this particular case here, I think the court would step in and say there just was not definite enough terms, therefore it wasn't an offer. Clearly, if Cogburn hadn't decided which parcel of land by that point in time, it was a rescission, which we'll talk about a little bit later on here. But that's kind of, I think, how the court would deal with that type of a situation. All right, issues. There was no agreed upon price, although again, I talked about Roy Bean would be able to deal with that. The bigger question is no agreed upon parcel of land, and then the revocation or rescission of that offer was done before any acceptance, which we'll talk about a little bit here later on. All right. So again, definite terms. Offer's terms must be definite enough that clearly establish all terms of the offer. We sometimes call that a mirror image when we get into the acceptance, right? Because we have to know what the definite terms are, and then when the acceptance that comes in, that acceptance has to mirror the definite terms of the offer. All right, there are ways in which you can terminate an offer. Revocation, it's sort of the never mind, right? Type of a scenario. If you do that before they accept it, then there is no longer an offer. That offer has gone away. You can't come back and say, I accept that now, kind of a situation. Once it's been revoked, deal's up. All right. There is a rejection where the offeree clearly says no deal. Or the offeree rejects and gives a counter offer, right? In either of those scenarios. So for example, on the bike situation, right? I've offered to you to sell you my bike for $50. And you're like, no, I reject that. Well, then the offer's dead, right? If you say, well, $50 is good, but I want you to throw in the mud flaps. Well, in that situation, it's also dead because you have done a counteroffer where you said, I'm going to pay you the $50, but I want those mud flaps in addition. In either of those situations, it's a rejection. In the latter situation where you did a counteroffer, your counteroffer now becomes the actual offer in which the original offer, me, who's selling the bike to you, can accept that or not. I can say, nope, you're not getting the mud flaps, or I can say, you know what, that's fine. You can have the mud flaps. They fit that bike anyways, and they won't be any good to me, so I'll throw in the mud flaps for that $50, right? Yours was an offer, now mine was an acceptance, and we're good to go, right? That's kind of a rejection is a termination of an offer. A counteroffer is a rejection, and then now switching the parties in the scenarios, who's the offeror, who's the offeree, right? There's that right there. Counteroffer is a form of rejection, and the new offer reversing the roles of offeror and offeree. It can expire. If an offer has a time limit for acceptance and a time limit passes, offer is then rejected. If no time limit, then usually the court puts a reasonable time to accept that offer in a scenario, right? And so the idea is going to be what's the history between the parties, what's customary in the practice or industry, right? But if I told you, look, I'm going to give you till tomorrow at 3 o'clock to let me know whether you want to buy the bike for $50, and 3:03 comes around, it's a rejection. It's done. That offer's dead. You know, you call me up and say, hey, I accept that deal. And I say, okay, we have a deal still even though it's past 3. Then we're good to go. But if I said, nope, sorry, I've already sold it, and I sold it to somebody else at 3 o'clock because you didn't get a hold of me, then you can't come back and sue me for breach of contract. Okay. Sometimes operation of law. The offeror, me, or my scenario, I may die. Well, my estate doesn't have to sell that bike to you. Or I become incapacitated, aren't able to fill the deal. Something happens. Some car crashed into my garage and wiped out the bike that I would never have realized could have happened. Therefore, in that situation, as an operation of law, that offer is now dead. You can't come back. I wanted that bike. I accept and say I'm suing you now for you to find a bike for that same like that bike for $50. Court's going to say no. That bike is destroyed. Sorry, deal's done. All right, that's that intermission part of we talked about. That's video 1 for contracts. And remember, again, email me, call me if you have any questions. If there's something more you want to have, more examples, let me know. I'll do my best to send them out to you all and help make sure you understand the contract law and kind of understand what we're doing. Again, stay healthy, and I'll see you again here on video number 2.